Islamic State. I mean, their territorial defeat. And let's not forget, as many of us might have forgotten, that at one point they controlled, I think it was half of Syria and a third of Iraq. I mean, they're
faith in policymakers and intelligence agencies to do the right thing. I say that realizing that I'm obviously being critical. They did a really good job of deliberately recruiting people with known criminal backgrounds.
Hezbollah operatives involved in drug trafficking and money laundering. And no doubt we'll see some of that come out in Maduro's trial in New York and attacks by Israel against Shia communities in Lebanon. Yet Hezbollah still remains. Terrorism today is blending into organised crime, into proxy warfare, illicit finance, and even geopolitical competition. And it's decentralising, it's franchising, and it's embedded itself in criminal and even political ecosystems, which makes it much harder to track, to disrupt, and ultimately to defeat. I'm Dominic Bowen, and I'm host of the International Risk Podcast, where we go beyond the headlines and examine the forces that really matter when it comes to shaping international risk. And today's guest is Dr. Colin P. Clarke. He's the Executive Director of the Soufan Centre, and he's one of the sharpest analysts working at that intersection of terrorism, insurgency, criminal networks, and geopolitics, from ISIS and Hamas to Hezbollah and far-right extremism, and the crime-terror nexus. His work really helps us understand how political violence is mutating and what that means for the global threat landscape today. Dr. Colin Clarke, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Whereabouts in the world do we find you today, Colin?
Talking to you today from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Western PA.
Very cool. Very cool. Nice. Well, look, thanks for taking the time today. Colin, I think back, and I'm showing my age a little bit here, but I remember when I was a very junior officer in the military, one night getting woken up at, I think it was 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning from my colleagues who at that time, being young officers, had a habit of being quite violent towards other fellow young officers, being woken up at 2 in the morning to come to the TV room, which of course I refused. And then eventually realized it was something serious. And I walked into the TV room it's horrible to even repeat the words, but just as the second jet was flying into the World Trade Center. And of course, our world, working for the government, just changed completely overnight. And then, since then I've worked for quite a few different government agencies and ultimately all of it has been funded and pushed by the global war on terror and what's followed after that. But terrorism's not the same as it was in 2000, let alone what it was like in 2005. So can you maybe talk us through how have you seen terrorism evolve over the last couple of decades to where we're at today?
I think if you look at 9/11 and you look at where the terrorism threat landscape is today, I would say the attack surface has broadened significantly. For a good chunk of the so-called GWAT, the Global War on Terrorism, putting aside the name, which I think is terrible because we declared war on a tactic, but that's something we like to do in the United States. War on poverty, war on crime, war on drugs, which I think we lost, war on gluten or whatever other nefarious things out there lurking to harm us. But today in 2026, I would say the threat is probably more diverse than ever. And this is something several years ago, Bruce Hoffman and I wrote about. We called the threat kaleidoscopic in nature. So it was broadening. It wasn't just Sunni jihadists. There was all these other threats manifesting as well. And I think we see that very well today. Sunni jihadists, Shia extremists, far right, far left, technophobes, which are people that are averse to the creeping ubiquity of technology and artificial intelligence. So they're kind of pushing back against that. There's any number of things that could motivate violent extremists today. And so I think more than ever, we really have to be a jack of all trades, right? Rather than specializing in one kind of narrow field of political violence.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. And, look, thanks very much for the service of your family and no doubt the sacrifices that you and they made in service of that. I think anyone that's served in the Marines and had a family that served has made sacrifices, whether you deployed yourself or not. But, thanks very much for their service. And we know Bruce Hoffman well. I remember reading his books when I was in Iraq. I was studying remotely whilst deployed to Iraq and read his books. And it was a real pleasure. We had him on the podcast back in episode 182 about far-right terrorism in America. Bruce Hoffman had published some work on that. So Fantastic scholar and author and a real thinker about terrorism. But you've certainly written a lot yourself. You've got some great books, and we'll link to those down below for anyone that's interested in looking at them and hopefully purchasing them. But you wrote more recently that in 2025, terrorism means something very different now. And I really like that wording because that's actually something that I've been saying a lot. In 2025, I was saying to a lot of business leaders, the landscape that we're operating in is so different today than what it ever has been. And then what I've been saying for Q1 of 2026 to business leaders is, 2026 is not the same as 2025 even. We're evolving at such a speed and with such dramatic changes. But what did you specifically mean when you said that 2025 about terrorism, it means something different now?
Well, you alluded to it. You talked about the speed of change. And I think, how quickly things are changing today. And really, this isn't, look, terrorism is a microcosm of broader society. And so the same changes we see in society, we'll see terrorists take advantage of too. Um, Technology is driving a lot of this. So if you think about various forms of emerging tech, right? You've got unmanned aerial systems or drones, including commercial off the shelf drones or hobby drones, which anyone can get their hands on. They're cheap, they're plentiful, they're not very difficult to learn. And there's all sorts of ways that if you really wanted to become handy and an expert in using these things, you could do it legally. So there are a number of message boards online where you can go and talk about the ins and outs with other people about, how these things work. I flipped on ESPN the other day, to watch something, to watch college basketball, and there was drone racing on. I don't think that it's a, sport quite, but the fact that it's become so prevalent in society, the ease with which you can master these things and then direct them toward, more pernicious ends, it's seemingly easy to do, right? The barrier to entry to master these technologies has been lowered significantly. I'll list a few others: 3D printing or additive manufacturing, right? Printing weapons, printing the things that you would need. Artificial intelligence, obviously, right? ChatGPT, Claude, ways to think through attack planning. We've seen AI used in a number of terror attacks so far for planning purposes. Um, Encrypted communications, virtual currencies, right? These are all kind of emerging technologies that violent extremists can harness and leverage to commit attacks. So that's changing quite a bit in 2026, and it's changing rapidly.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think another area that I find quite interesting, noting that at least ostensibly, many extremist groups claim to be motivated by religion and a higher cause, and something that seems quite noble, although, of course, it's taken an extreme arm. But at the same time, we've seen that these same terrorist groups are increasingly resembling businesses in how they generate revenue through criminal activities like drug trafficking, extortion, and organized crime in order to sustain their operations, which I understand from a business point of view, they need to sustain their operations. But when their motivation is ostensibly to create a better world, a world that's accordance with the rules of their prophet and their gods, I can't help but think that there's some significant confusion there, and we've certainly seen that with groups in many different areas. Can you talk to us about that and how these groups justify actions which most of us would see are probably not consistent with either the Quran or the Bible or any other holy text, and yet it's what's funding their operations?
Yeah, so really good points, and you're not the first person to point out these inconsistencies. The first book that I wrote, Terrorism Inc., looked at how a range of terrorist groups funded their organizations, both their organizational capabilities and operational capabilities. One of the groups I looked at was the Taliban, right? So this, group that's very religiously austere, follows Deobandi Islam. There's all these strictures for what people can and can't do, yet this was a group that also sold drugs, right, and engaged in opium trafficking, which would be counter to a lot of the Islamic religious principles. But it also shows that these groups are pragmatic, and so they're religious when they have to be, and they're selling drugs when they need to fund their organization. I mean, we can get into a number of other things that I think are also un-Islamic. My previous point on emerging technologies, tech's opening up new avenues for this. So if you look at Islamic State Khorasan province, which for my money is one of the biggest threats to the West, when you think of a group that has that intersection of intent and capability to launch external operations, but they're using Monero, they're using other virtual currencies to raise money. I think, and the crime terror nexus is a topic I'm really passionate about. I wrote a piece in Foreign Policy last year with my colleague Clara Brokart, where we looked at ways that Hezbollah engages in the crime terror nexus, and that's something that's probably going to change going forward because of the extent to which the Iranians have been battered. They're not going to be able to provide that same level of funding to Hezbollah, which, according to the U.S. government and open source, at one point was up to $700 million a year. That's not something you replace easily. Hezbollah does have a diversified criminal portfolio that stretches from Latin America to West Africa and beyond. These guys have their fingers in everything. Drugs, used cars, counterfeit pharmaceuticals, you name it, they're involved in it, and they've found a way to profit from it. But I think the group that probably tapped into the crime terror nexus the most efficiently was Islamic State at its peak, 2015, 2016. They did a really good job of deliberately recruiting people with known criminal backgrounds. And so they even put together this really, what I thought was impressive from a marketing advertising standpoint, this kind of recruiting campaign where they were putting out these posters online essentially saying those people with the worst past sometimes have the best futures. And so it was this redemption narrative for people that had spent time in jail, by the way, where they radicalized and became interested and receptive to these ideas that were now resonating with them and saying, come purify yourself, right? And what did the Islamic State get when they got these kind of criminals from, Brussels and Paris and all of these European cities? Well, they got Westerners, they got people who know how to find safe houses, the logistics of crime that also work well for terrorism, and they found willing recruits. These were also the same individuals that went back to conduct the Bataclan attack in November 2015 and the Brussels bombing in March 2016, right? So really useful from a recruiting standpoint, and a lot of that usefulness was situated in the crime terror nexus.
And what's your opinion, Colin? And I hope this isn't an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I work a lot in high risk situations, and I have for the last 20 years. I was in Damascus 2 weeks ago. I'll be back in Ukraine next week. And I always ask myself, I try to be a little bit more mature than I was in my 20s. And I try to ask myself, is it worth it? Is this mission worth it? Is the risk I'm going to face worth it? And I certainly know back in 2014, 15, when we were working in Syria, I had half my team kidnapped when I was working with Médecins Sans Frontières. And you sort of have to look at the risks. And I know that the programs, the issues, the things that we're doing are really justify the risk. But honestly, sometimes you have to say, you know what, getting my head cut off because I believe in Jesus Christ, by someone who says, no, he goes for a different religion when the day before he was raping girls and young boys. You sort of go, I don't know, there's something not right here. This equation doesn't add up. And so I wonder, my question to you, Colin, is a lot of the groups that call themselves Islamic extremism, do they actually believe in Islam, or is this just more about being part of a family and a community as opposed to actually believing in the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say. I mean, it depends on the individual, right? And so, like painting with a broad brush, it's also not my place to say who is a real Muslim and who isn't. But I will say, from my understanding, the ideology that groups like ISIS follow is a perversion of the religion they claim to represent. And they always conveniently allow for things that they want to do anyway. Like many religions, a lot of this is a cover for power and access to power and manipulation. And so, very cultish like behavior that you see in these groups as they establish kind of like the in group, the out group, and others. But it's absolutely a perversion on the religion. It's a very fundamentalist interpretation. And there's real aspects of kind of terrorism and political violence built into that. Well, I can do this because of X, right? Or I can sell drugs because the apostates are consuming them. There's always this convenient loophole or caveat or fatwa. Look, and as somebody that is what My mom would probably call me a buffet Catholic. Like, I'll take this, I'll leave that. Like, I'm familiar with the picking and choosing, but I'm also not on a worldwide quest for domination.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. Thanks for explaining that way. I appreciate it. And you mentioned Islamic State. I mean, their territorial defeat, and let's not forget, as many as might have forgotten, that at one point they controlled, I think it was half of Syria and a third of Iraq. I mean, their control was massive. It was massive. But ultimately, they were defeated, and it's led to this decentralized terrorist diaspora with cells conducting these low level attacks globally rather than these large scale conquests that we saw about a decade ago. But you did quite a bit of work on ISIS around that time. What did analysts get right, and what did we get wrong when it comes to considering what this post caliphate threat would look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's one I've obviously thought a lot about. I published a book in 2019 called "After the Caliphate: The Future of the Islamic State and the Terrorist Diaspora." So at the time, I was seeing this group coming to an end from a physical, territorial standpoint. And you're right. At one point, they controlled territory equivalent to the size of Great Britain. Right. This is a group that recruited, um, you know, tens of thousands of foreigners from across the world from 80 different countries to come join it. So highly effective from a recruiting standpoint. Um, it's hard to say what people got right, what people got wrong, because a lot of people are now kind of weighing in with their opinions. I'll tell you what I think the United States got wrong about this, which was, and you've heard President Trump say it on numerous occasions, he said the Islamic State has been defeated. And I think because we were able to remove that final piece of territory in around Baghouz in the spring of 2019, we kind of washed our hands. We were like, all right, that's done. Let's move on. But if you look at how the group decentralized, spread globally throughout sub Saharan Africa, throughout parts of South Asia, any serious counterterrorism analyst would tell you this group is far from defeated. And to think otherwise is just naive, and frankly just gets it wrong. So it was very knowable that this group would shift to a franchise based model and would seek to incite homegrown violent extremists from Montreal to Melbourne and everywhere in between. So what's changed is the priorities for Western governments. Frankly, the threat level has always ebbed and flowed. Look, I'll give you an example. After the Bondi Beach attack in Sydney in December, which was horrible, I was asked to come on TV and interviewed by all these media outlets, and the underlying premise was, is ISIS back? Which fundamentally misunderstands that this group never went away in the first place. And for me in the counterterrorism community, this is like a no shit, right? Like, okay, like, yeah, they didn't go anywhere. We know that. But it speaks to, I think, our attention span, right? Of just like what the bright shiny object is. But for people in this field, we knew the group never went away. I mean, look, there was the attack in New Orleans on New Year's Day here in the United States a few years ago. If you actually look at arrests, there's a lot of disrupted plots and people that are still very much attempting to carry the name of this group forward. Hell, we had two last month. We had an Islamic State inspired attack in New York City, and we had another one at Old Dominion University. So if the group is dead, how is it still managing to, and incite homegrown violent extremists throughout the world? So that's something that's bothered me because our attention has shifted to, and you alluded to this in the introduction, great power competition, right? We're distracted now by 5 million things. And look, I'm not going to sit here and also say that I think terrorism is an existential issue. I don't. It's just what I've chosen to dedicate my life to. I think the pacing threat for the United States is the rise of China, no doubt. It makes sense to shift resources to think about that. However, what we've done is thrown the baby out with the bathwater. We've said we've moved on from this threat. It's no longer an issue. We have to worry about Gaza and Ukraine and Greenland and whatever they're looking at, in the moment. And we've totally kind of made, look, coming off the global war on terrorism, there was always bound to be a correction. And I think that was the right thing, right? Because we, in some sense, overcommitted resources because the threat was so severe. Frankly, 9/11 was such a shock to the system that we put everything we had toward that threat. And we did a damn good job at kind of slowly working through that threat. And so there was always going to be this natural correction or deviation back toward the mean. But we've overcorrected. We've taken our CT resources, personnel, funding, and we've put them in all these other baskets. And now we're left at home. I mean, look, if you want to get into some of the current news cycle, there's news just yesterday that the Trump White House is organizing a summit on Antifa in the summer. Look, and I'm not going to downplay that left wing violence is a real thing. It is. I have no ideological agenda, right? But what they're doing is letting politics dictate the threat landscape when it should be intelligence. And I think that's a grave error. We still haven't seen a counterterrorism strategy from this administration, even though last summer we were promised one was imminent. So it's a really frustrating time to be in the counterterrorism community, and as someone that views a very serious threat landscape, put against governments that don't seem like they're taking it seriously, or they want to play politics with it, which is frankly just dumb and it's dangerous.
Yeah, I think if we could convince all politicians to be using risk-based and intelligence-based approaches, we'd be in a very different position. But alas, we are where we are. And when we look at ISIS, and I want to come back to extreme left and extreme right actions, but I just want to finish the conversation around ISIS and some of the ISIS regional affiliates, it's like ISIS Kordofan, as well as this hybrid model of lone wolves. How concerned should we be about that threat? We know that Germany has had just repeated ramming attacks. So has the UK. Sweden's had a couple of terrorist attacks. We know that I think there's been 20 terrorist plots foiled recently in the UK alone. MI5 has been very very vocal on that topic. How concerned should we be as citizens, business leaders, and academics about the actual threat from groups like ISIS right now?
Yeah, look, I don't think we need to cower in our homes, right? I think again, the threat ebbs and flows, and it does so in response to a number of factors and variables, including the geopolitical context, right? So with the Iran war, we're in a heightened threat environment. We just are. That comes from Shia extremists, right? Including people that are inspired by Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies, but it actually also comes from Sunni jihadists too. Let me explain a little bit there. There's no love lost between Islamic State supporters, Al Qaeda supporters, and Iran, right? That's a Shia country. That's the ultimate apostate. However, war and conflict makes for strange bedfellows. The Iranians have provided sanctuary and safe haven to Saif and other Al Qaeda leaders for a very long time. Why? Because it's convenient, despite the ideological difference. We saw this after the Hamas attacks of October 7th, 2023. The Islamic State has long castigated Hamas for being apostates because they sat for elections. They don't like Hamas. They don't think Hamas is the real deal. They're not extreme enough. If you can kind of square that, right? ISIS is saying you're not extreme enough to the group that went in and did what they did in southern Israel. They still benefit from these conflicts because, in their mind, a rising tide lifts all boats. If there's worldwide anger over Gaza, they're going to tap into that. They're going to frame their propaganda to get people pissed off and to push them over that line from, I'm really fired up about this to I'm going to go do something about this in the real world. So, that's very much a dynamic at play, and it's something that we're going to see right now with the conflict in Iran, and this is going to have long lasting reverberations. This is not something that's going to peter out soon. So again, it ebbs and flows. You mentioned a couple of ISIS affiliates. Look, my advice is the same as it's always been. If you see something, say something. Be aware of your surroundings, but don't change your daily life because of this. We should have faith in policymakers and intelligence agencies to do the right thing. I say that realizing that I'm obviously being critical of what's happening in the United States. But look, these are groups that are highly capable and determined to attack the West, and that includes not just ISIS-K, which is at the very top of that list, ISIS in Somalia, Islamic State affiliates in the Sahel, which could have connections to the diaspora in Europe. My colleague Lucas Weber just wrote a really fantastic piece on foreign policy on that issue. So, range of threats, take it seriously. But look, you don't have to go hide in your basement.
Yeah, thanks for confirming that. That's no doubt appreciated. You talked about, you mentioned left wing extremism. My understanding is that from the latest data that left wing extremists are traditionally much less lethal and had a much lower base when it comes to actual number of incidents, but that's increasing. Whereas right wing extremists come from a higher base, but statistically that's actually decreasing. One of the things you mentioned, Bondi in Australia as well, one of the things the Australian Prime Minister was criticised for mercilessly was that after the attack, he refused to call it Islamic terrorism. He said, the threat from left and right wing and other forms of terrorism. And everyone was just sort of going, hold on, where's the left wing terrorists in Australia? Where are the right wing terrorists in Australia? Why won't you just call this what this incident was? How should we look at the difference between the various types of terrorists and terrorist groups? Are they all equal, or does it require some nuance there?
People, um, tiptoe on this line. He's a politician, so he has different motivations. My advice would be call it like you see it, and doesn't sound like he did there for, attempting to be too politically correct or whatever advice he was getting at the time. But look, if we have a jihadi attack, there's nothing wrong with saying this was a jihadi attack if we have evidence pointing toward that. If you don't, you lose credibility, and it makes people think that you're playing politics and you have ulterior motives. You're right. Traditionally, left wing terrorism, depending on what period in time you look at, has been less lethal. It's been more about property destruction and vandalism, and kind of lower level issues. Various points we've had groups like the Earth Liberation Front and other kind of eco and environmental and animal rights groups that have been drawn to terrorism and violence. I think, and I've been predicting this for years, frankly, that we're going to see a spike in left wing violence and terrorism. And we have some of that's called reciprocal radicalization. When you have the rise of the far right, you're going to have an answer on the left, right? And then an answer to that. So we're going to ping pong back and forth here. There was a plot disrupted in the United States by the Turtle Island Liberation Front. We've seen an interesting kind of melding of left wing college students and kind of pro Hezbollah, pro Hamas types. That's giving me like big Weather Underground vibes and Bader Meinhof and some of those older left wing groups from the 70s. But the data shows that far right groups have traditionally been far more lethal. They're more organized. They typically, you know, the body count is much higher. I mean, look, I'm speaking to you today from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where the Tree of Life attack happened, right? There's been other attacks like the attack in El Paso, um, and many others that the body count's just higher. The problem in the U.S. and you may have this in other countries is it gets tribal. The debate is like, look, the left's not as dangerous as the right, or and it becomes almost an identity thing with politics. Again, I'm not a political person. I want to identify it and figure out ways to stop it. But you also have to understand it and figure out what's motivating it, if it's localized, if it's a global threat. And too often we get really wrapped up in what the politics of this mean, and people start getting defensive. I think we should be agnostic of the ideology. We should be looking at the threat and understanding how we counter it.
All right, thanks for explaining that. Colin, your work on Hezbollah's funding argues that the group survives through diversification, good thing, but it also includes criminal enterprise, not so good. Now, Venezuela, if we all look back to January, we might have forgotten about Venezuela after everything that's happened since then, but Venezuela has long been identified as the transit hub for cocaine coming out of Colombia. And there's been long held reports highlighting these links between the Maduro regime and cartels, as well as Hezbollah operatives involved in drug trafficking and money laundering. And no doubt we'll see some of that come out in Maduro's trial in New York. Now we're seeing, and I'm quoting the Israeli Minister of Defense, but also the Israeli Finance Minister, has what they've said is deliberately disproportionate attacks by Israel against Shia communities in Lebanon. Yet Hezbollah still remains. Even the Lebanese government has banned Hezbollah, yet they still remain. What does this tell us about the resilience of organizations like Hezbollah and how they manage to endure such significant pressure?
Yeah, I think Hezbollah is fairly unique when it comes to terrorist organizations. Even after 9/11, folks in the US government said, on the grand scale, Al Qaeda is the B team, Hezbollah is the A team, right? This is a group that, as you know, emerged in the early 1980s, was responsible for attacking the United States. It's an Iranian proxy. It received a boost after the Israelis invaded Lebanon in 1982. Right, they stayed for 18 years until 2000, and so this group, really framed itself as the resistance. It was the bulwark and the only group standing up to the Israeli occupation. It's part of Lebanon's socio-political and economic fabric now, which is why the Israelis are finding it so difficult to dislodge the group. We can get into all the kind of cliches and truisms of, are we killing more terrorists than we're creating? So after the pager attack in September, I think it was September 2024, which was kind of right off of like ripped out of Hollywood, like the dynamics of this. Really took out some important cadres within the group's middle tier and middle leadership. But look, this is a group that again, like is recruiting people from a young age. Everyone that lives in these Hezbollah strongholds supports the group, even if they don't always agree with its actions. And so, disarming the group seems like almost an impossible task. And I just don't think it's a group that you're ever going to be able to fully eradicate, given its popularity in Lebanon, given how long it's been around, given its longstanding funding pipelines, which we've talked about. Um, and I think it's going to capitalize on what's perceived as, uh, again, like, look, the Israelis are in Lebanon now. Have they learned from their mistakes? This can be, a real slippery slope that leads to mission creep. And I think the longer the Israelis stay in southern Lebanon, the more they're actually breathing life back into this group because they're giving people a reason to join, a reason to resist. And I think it's going to ultimately prove counterproductive and quite myopic on Israel's part.
And for those listeners that don't remember the pager attack, it was in mid-September 2024 when pagers exploded simultaneously after receiving a coded message, and this was an Israeli operation. There was 12 people killed, sadly including 2 children, but there was about 3,000 people that were injured with hand, face, and eye wounds because of the blasts. But then the next day, there was another blast involving, I think it was walkie-talkies, and then there was another 20 deaths and about 450 injuries. So in total, there was about 39 people killed and over 3,500 wounded from these attacks. So incredibly complex planning and operations, and multiple companies purchased by Israeli security and intelligence services in order to carry out this attack. But as you said, sometimes you have to look at, how many terrorists. And I think that's a really good way of interesting, or at least an interesting way of wording it about how many terrorists do we kill versus how many terrorists do we create. And I think looking a little bit further south, if we look at Hamas, despite the just phenomenal levels of destruction across Palestine, Hamas seems to still be in place. I mean, how does that occur?
Look, again, this is counterterrorism can't just be purely kinetic, right? People join terrorist groups because of grievances, and those grievances can be diverse. But when you assume a scorched earth approach in a completely draconian counterterrorism and counterinsurgency campaign, um, there was zero effort to win hearts and minds, right? Absolutely none. There was no attempt to do it. And so, unless you literally kill every person there, again, which is not feasible nor advisable, nor is it moral, ethical, or legal, you're going to end up with some proportion of that population that then rejoins Hamas or joins Hamas or actually gravitates to a more hardline group because believe it or not, you can actually get more hardline than Hamas. You can join a Salafi jihadi group with a more similar ideology to the Islamic State. So, again, the Israelis live in a tough neighborhood, but a lot of the actions that they're taking, I think, are going to ultimately come back to haunt them. And one thing I've questioned throughout this campaign is, are these the actions that are designed to help one individual, namely Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, at the expense of what's likely going to be decades of anti Semitism that flow off the back of this because people conflate Jews everywhere with the actions of Israel, which I don't think is right, but we've seen it time and time again. I think what Netanyahu has done over the last several years in the Middle East will prove to actually be really really counterproductive for Jews worldwide. At the same time, it's not guaranteed to make Israel any safer.
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant point. And, when we look at the September 11 bombers and the heinous attacks they did and what some of their motivations were. Certainly, there was wars, that have been occurring for the last couple of decades before that certainly motivated them. And you think about, it doesn't matter how moderate you are or where you sit on the political spectrum, it was impossible not to see children and women with just absolutely horrific injuries or just killed after the attacks. Now, of course, Israel had a right to defend itself. This is, I'm not disputing that for a moment, but some of the images coming out of Palestine were just, it would be hard to imagine that some people wouldn't become radicalized. Good, normal people wouldn't become radicalized after seeing some of that. And I wonder, I know you've spoken and written a lot about the information warfare and the propaganda advantages that some of these groups have. What should we be looking at? What should we be considering at today when it comes to that? And, Iran is a great example. There's been some, I want to use the word brilliant, but I don't want to make it sound like it's a good thing. But some of the propaganda coming out of Iran is quite clever. What are the advantages that some of these groups have? Whether we're looking at groups like the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, some of their proxies, or Hezbollah or Hamas, what are the propaganda advantages that they have today?
These groups have a global following. They're adept at using technology. I'll give you an example from the Islamic State. I wrote a piece with a guy named Charlie Winter, who's an expert on ISIS propaganda, for a publication called War on the Rocks. I don't even remember what year this was, maybe 2017. But what we did was we were studying how the Islamic State deliberately recruited people with a background in marketing, in PR, in communications, and actually enticed them to join the group by saying, we'll give you this title of emir, or this housing allotment, or this number of sex slaves. Deliberately recruited people with backgrounds that they knew would be helpful for the information warfare strategy, and it showed, because everybody said, "Wow, this stuff's really slick. It's really sophisticated." It was segmented almost in the way a Madison Avenue advertising firm would segment their information operations, which is to say, the message they sent to recruit a 40-year-old, Uyghur from Western China were not the same messages that were sent to a 22-year-old, petty thief from Molenbeek in Brussels. And they knew that, and they knew how to appeal to different groups. They knew what themes resonated. And it was, from that standpoint, impressive. Like, I never want to compliment the group, but if we're simply, assessing it from an objective standpoint, it was really effective in what they did. They understood their target audience. They put together these campaigns, and they worked quite well. Today, again, to go back to emerging tech, because that's a through line that kind of runs through a lot of these conversations, they're experimenting with AI. They're using AI to help translate their propaganda into different languages. They're using it to spread reach and resonance. And it's helping. The more you can offload working on propaganda to AI and to other kind of machine learning technologies, the more time you have to focus on attack planning, right? And so it's simply kind of delegation that frees you up to do the more lethal parts of being a terrorist. And so that should be concerning to everybody. The learning curve is not great. We're seeing these groups improve over time. I've written about this. Tech Against Terrorism, which is it's a really great nonprofit based in the UK that looks at how terrorists use technologies. They've written a lot about this. They're analyzing this. And so it's a really fascinating subset of terrorism studies that's moving incredibly fast. The change is rapid. It's dizzying. And, terrorists, we usually say are one or two steps ahead. My concern is this is allowing them to get 4 or 5 steps.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks for explaining that. And another theme that we know, and we've all seen it, and certainly for those of us that have had the blessing of working in these countries, we've seen in Pakistan, in India, and Afghanistan. Obviously, we've talked about Iran, where this state terrorism actor, there is a significant overlap between state and non-state actors and the threats that come from them. I know you've been working on some work with Russian-based actors from the Wagner Group. Can you tell us a little bit about this counterterrorism and this great power competition. You mentioned China before, but of course I just mentioned Russia as well. Is there an overlap we need to be considering when it comes to terrorism and state forces?
Yeah, great question. I would urge anyone listening to go look at our new report that we just put out at the Soufan Center on Russian hybrid warfare. So we looked at how the Russians conduct hybrid tactics in 6 countries: the UK, France, Germany, Moldova, Georgia, and Estonia. And so go look at how the Russians act in these countries. Some of these incidents I would categorize more as traditional acts of terrorism. Frankly, we don't call it that because there's a political element here and there's other kind of things at play. But if you actually look at the tactics themselves, they very much reek of terrorism and not kind of some other cute name that we come up to avoid having to deal with the Russians head on. Um, I think we've shifted a lot of resources away from counterterrorism to great power competition because I think we fundamentally misunderstand what great power competition is. So when we take assets out of the Sahel and out of Central Asia to say that we're focusing on what we call GPC, great power competition, we're we're failing to understand that those are the regions where this is actually occurring, great power competitions. I think the Russians get that. That's why they bring the Wagner Group or Africa Corps into theater. Um, yeah, we have a book coming out, myself, Chris Faulkner, and Raphael Perrins on the Wagner Group called Moscow's Mercenaries that will be out in 2 months. So through Columbia University Press. We've looked at this group for years closely and how they operate. And frankly, I think we're going to see other countries emulate that. The Chinese are already using private security firms throughout Africa, not in the same way that the Russians do, but they are using them. The Turks do, and I would expect other countries to follow suit. And so I think it's so difficult to disaggregate counterterrorism from great power competition. Often we're kind of like, these are artificial creations and walls that we're kind of building up to kind of separate one from the other. But there's actually a lot more overlap if we are able to kind of look into these things and attempt to disaggregate them.
Thanks, and we'll link to that report. And for anyone that's been listening that's found even just anything that we've discussed today slightly interesting, do have a look at the Soufan Centre website, and I promise you that you'll be geeking out on many of the maps, whether it's from the Strait of Hormuz, whether it's the weapons that are being used, US bases in the region, or of course the analysis about Russia and the Wagner Group. There's so much on that website. You really will find it. Plenty of things in there to read, and you'll find that enjoyable. But Colin, just as we wrap up, one question that I ask all guests that come on the International Risk podcast is when you do look around the world, what are the international risks that actually concern you the most?
Go back to something you said earlier, which is how is terrorism different today? I wrote a piece in Foreign Policy with Chris Costa. So we wrote a piece for Foreign Policy. Nothing novel in the sense of one of the risks we pointed out was as folks move their attention away from terrorism and toward great power competition, nuclear proliferation, I think there's a lack of appreciation that terrorism itself can cause those things. So if you look at the attack in Kashmir last year, I believe it was last April, so about a year ago, um, uh, when you have jihadi groups launching attacks in Indian or Pakistani administered Kashmir, you're bringing to the brink of conflict two nuclear powered countries, right? Go back to how did World War One start, right? It was actually a terrorist attack that triggered it, that catalyzed it. The stakes are much different now with nuclear powers. And so if you have groups acting as a kind of tripwire to bring about intrastate war, that's war between two nation states, conventional military conflict with nuclear weapons, that to me is a microcosm of how we tend to underestimate the power of terrorism, right? That it can have 9/11, right? It was a terrorist attack that essentially led to 2 decades of US involvement in the Middle East. Now, I'm not saying Iraq was connected to 9/11 at all. We made that conflation. That was something that was a United States creation. However, it still provided right fodder for those that wanted to engage and embark on these kind of regime change wars, which I would point out haven't really worked out well anywhere we've conducted them, whether it's Iraq, Libya, and now Iran.
Thanks for taking us on that tour of the world, and thanks for explaining that. And most importantly, thanks very much for your time and coming on the podcast today, Colin.
I really appreciated it. Thanks so much. I had a lot of fun.
Good. Well, that was a really great conversation with Dr. Colin P. Clarke. He's the Executive Director of the Soufan Centre. And I really appreciated hearing Colin's insights about terrorism, how it's evolving, the proxy groups involved, and the criminal networks, and how these links between terrorism, organised crime, and geopolitics are all merging together. Today's podcast was produced and coordinated by Edward Penrose. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again in the next couple of days.